Tonight, we'll look back at the life and legacy of George H.W. Bush, chief spokesman for the 92 campaign and chairman of the Prime Policy Group, Charlie Black. Charlie, thanks so much for joining me. You know, Charlie...
Judge, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure on this sad day.
Yes, indeed it is. And throughout the hour, Charlie, we're going to talk about the president and his incredible accomplishments and his legacy. But you worked side by side with him when he was president and when he was running for a second term. Tell us something about him that no one knows.
Well, he was, some people know this, but he was an incredible man, a man of personal courage and political courage. He believed in public service for the sake of service, not just for political ego gratification. But the thing I would say is he was uncommonly kind and courteous. Now, I worked with him for about 5 years, you know, closely, almost daily. And of all the people I ever worked with in politics, President Bush thanked me more for helping him out than all the others put together. During his presidency, I did hundreds of TV interviews on his behalf. I defended his tax increase when he broke the tax pledge over and over on television. And he would call me, or when I saw him, he would say, you've taken many bullets from me on this, and I have to thank you for it. And, of course, I would say it's a privilege and an honor to work for you, Mr. President. You don't need to thank me, but he kept thanking me.
Well, he clearly was a gentleman, a refined man, and an elegant man. But you seem to indicate when we talked a little earlier today that he wasn't a man who put his finger to the winds and tested for the political calculus or decided things based upon polls.
No, he had the. He was almost a political junkie in terms of his interest in polls and politics. He had in his private office in the White House residence, he had 4 televisions there. In those days, we just had 4 networks, and he would watch, you know, all of them at once. So he was interested in politics. He liked it, but he saw the job of being president as distinct from politics. You were supposed to do what you thought was right. You were supposed to work across party lines and be civil about it. You know, Judge, 2 of his best friends in the world were Democrats, Lud Ashley from Ohio and Sonny Montgomery from Mississippi, who were congressmen he served with in the 60s, 20 years before he was president. And he kept it that way. He had as many friends on the Democratic side as the Republican.
And indeed, it was his friends, Charlie, on the Democratic side who pushed him to go back on his promise. You were there during the calculation as it related to the read my lips, no more taxes. Tell us about what happened on the inside there.
Well, the president was very concerned about the federal deficit, which, you know, if you look at it today, my gosh, it's 20 times as high. But he felt the economy was in danger of slowing down because of the size of the deficit. Of course, the economy did slow down in 1991 and 92. And so he thought we needed to cut the deficit, but the Congress was controlled by the Democrats, both houses. So any budget arrangement had to be a compromise. It had to be a deal. They insisted on a tax increase. So he eventually made a deal that, and Governor Sununu, when he's on later, can give you more details than I can. He was there the whole time. But $3 of spending cuts for every dollar of tax increase. Now, the president knew he had pledged not to increase taxes, but he thought this was the right thing to do for the country. He asked me about it once as a political advisor, and I said, yes, it'll hurt you politically. If you break that pledge, it'll hurt you politically. And he said, well, is there any way I could win? I said, well, if the economy gets really good, then people might be able to overlook it or willing to overlook it. But it's probably going to hurt your reelection. He did it anyhow because he thought it was the right thing for the country.
And when he did do it, he realized the risk that was associated with his going forward with a deal with the Democrats and going back on his promise. He understood it?
He understood it. and he understood that it might well cost him his reelection.
All right, let's talk about him and his interest in politics. His kids were interested in politics, obviously. Two of them running for governor in the same year, one in Florida, one in Texas. How did he and Barbara handle the politics of their children as opposed to the politics of their own?
They were always very proud of all of their children, and especially those who ventured into politics, George W. and Jeb. When they both ran for governor in the same year, I mean, they were keeping up with the races in detail and talking to their sons on a regular basis. And the interesting thing was, as we approached Election Day in 1994, it looked like George, President Bush 43, had a better chance to be elected governor of Texas than Jeb did to become governor of Florida. He was behind in the polls. So even though the Bushes were in Houston and were prepared to be in Austin with George W. Bush on election night, they ended up getting on a private plane at the last minute and flying to Florida to be with Jeb. And, of course, what happened is Jeb lost and George won. But that's how much they cared about their sons.
Well, then in the last few seconds, what do you think the president will be most remembered for, Charlie?
He should be, and I hope he's most remembered for his masterful diplomacy and foreign policy expertise.
Yes.
Ronald Reagan won the Cold War, but finishing the Cold War and cleaning it up and leaving a unified Europe and a cooperative Soviet Union took a lot of hard work. And we had the right person in there, because President Bush 41 had all the experience and had all the relationships around the world to pull that off. That plus winning the Gulf War and pulling out of the Gulf War once the mission of freeing Kuwait was accomplished. Those are the things he should most be remembered for his expertise in world affairs.
All right, Charlie Black, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Judge.
All right, and joining me now, former New Hampshire Governor John Sununu, who served as chief of staff for late President Bush. All right, good evening, Governor. I know that
Judge.
I know that you are personally very sorrowful tonight, and I just want to find a little bit out about the president and the fact that we all know he was a man that excelled at everything. He excelled at sports. He excelled in education. I mean, he was accepted at Yale. He excelled at patriotism. At the age of 18, he signed up to go into the, I believe, into the Navy. And he had 58 combat missions. One was his plane was hit, and he ends up being picked up in the Pacific by a submarine. This man is a hero with accolades that we don't often hear about.
Well, he was a great man. He was an easy person to be a friend with. And he was always a lot of fun. Even in the toughest times we had, we always found a few moments to have a good laugh.
And he, in addition to having a sense of humor, he was a man who was liked by everyone and was very much a diplomat. I mean, tell us about the man that you call the quiet man.
Well, he had a style which was not pushy, a style which was had a great component of listening to it. He had developed relationships over the years, but he also had this great capacity to put himself in the shoes of the person he was trying to deal with. He put himself in Gorbachev's shoes when he was trying to work out the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he nursed it along magnificently, not pushing too hard, but pushing fast enough to get things done. He put himself in the shoes of his opponents when he was trying to do the budget deal. And he certainly was a man who understood that there was a lot of value in getting agreements that were win-win.
And the fact that he very often had an opposing party in the legislative branch with as many as 260 Democrats to 175 Republicans in the House, 55
Judge,
of the...
Not often, always.
The whole
always.
Right, the whole term. And that he was able to get incredible, very legislation that will, be a part of his legacy, including the American with Disabilities Act.
I said it earlier today, he passed more domestic legislation of import than any president except Lyndon Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt. It was the budget agreement which produced the only surpluses we've had in decades, even though Bill Clinton liked to take credit for them. The 5-year budget agreement produced those. He had the Clean Air Bill,
right,
the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Bill, the legislation that established energy policy that opened up the path to energy independence, the crime bill. We could go on and on and on.
It is incredible. And, you know, when you talk about the passage of all of this legislation, you realize that this was a man with military accomplishments, and he apparently likened his political, the diplomacy to a mission. He said, I'm a man who sees life in terms of missions defined and missions completed. And I guess that philosophy carried him through not just the war, but through his political life as well.
Well, it is. And he had the capacity to understand just how much had to be done and what kind of a pace to put on it. It was reflected in his campaigns. It was reflected in his dealing with Congress on all these various issues. You know, think about this. It was a one-term presidency. So you add up all the things he did in foreign policy, all the things he did in domestic policy, and recognize that these were all going on simultaneously. We were doing all of this every day. And this president was smart enough to be able to handle those details, to be able to work with folks on a one-on-one basis when it was required. And as I said earlier, smart enough to take a little time out through the whole process and join us in a few laughs.
Well, and, you know, there is also much talk about the fact that he loved sports. He loved football. And we're going to talk about that. We got people he played golf with, the country music he loved. And he was a man who was able to do it all and also have a fabulous family that he spent time with and reared in a very, you know, not just religious, but in a very elegant and sophisticated and, you know, a patriotic way.
Judge, you talk about his love of sports. He was captain of the Yale baseball team. And there's really an iconic photo out there, people can find it online, of George H.W. Bush in his baseball uniform as captain of the team with Babe Ruth about 6 months before Babe Ruth died, accepting from Babe Ruth the memoir, Babe Ruth's memoirs for the Yale Library. And it's just an amazing photo of these two iconic figures, one from baseball and one from eventually American politics. And to get the two of them on the same occasion talking to each other has always been one of my great historical coincidences.
All right. Governor John Sununu, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on the president. And we know that your heart is filled with sorrow. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Judge.
Thank you. And memories of President Bush from the Reverend Franklin Graham and country music star George Strait still ahead tonight. But next, a fascinating story you likely haven't heard from George Bush's days as vice president. John Solomon spent some time with Mr. Bush and shares this amazing story with you next. Stay with us. You're going to like this.
We are Americans, part of something larger than ourselves. For 2 centuries, we've done the hard work of freedom, and tonight we lead the world in facing down a threat to decency and humanity.
Ruby Tuesday's new Homestyle Combo starting at $11.99. Choose from 6 all-new, creamy, hearty, savory, cheesy entrees, plus endless trips to the Garden Bar. Join us at Ruby.
And warn the out-of-control commanders of the Salvadoran military to end their death squads, which in some cases included even Catholic nuns. Tell us what happened.
It's an extraordinary story, most extraordinary. No one in America knew that it happened. It was a secret mission. They set up a cover trip where the vice president would go to Argentina, do some state business there, and then he disappears from Argentina on a Black Hawk helicopter. Very small team. It's Oliver North, Tony Bennedy, his longtime body man and advance man, and a couple Secret Service agents, and they fly in on a Black Hawk helicopter into the jungles of El Salvador. And it's George Bush's mission to go tell those commanders, you are going to stop killing civilians. You are going to get your act together. You're going to allow a democratic election, or President Reagan is going to cut you off. And he delivered it, and it's an extraordinary story. That it's about a 12-hour drama that if you wrote it for a script for a movie, it'd probably be a great box office hit.
Now, I understand that at some point there was a somewhat of a showdown between the El Salvadorians and the Secret Service.
Yeah, I think everybody going into the trip knew that this was going to be a high-risk trip. And the night before, the small team that was going couldn't sleep, so Vice President Bush decided to pick up their spirits, and so he started an impromptu game of poker to keep everybody's nerves down. He was calm as could be. Ollie North said he took him to the cleaners that night playing poker, but it kept everybody in a great spirit. And so they come in the next morning. They're going to a presidential villa that just two weeks earlier had been the site of a slaughter where civilians had been slaughtered. President Reagan and Vice President Bush had picked this location specifically to send a message. We're going to come right to the place where you committed these crimes, and we're going to deliver this message. So they get to this presidential villa. They did a quick paint job to get all the blood and bullet holes out of there. And the vice president is meeting with the president of Salvador first, and in walk a bunch of these soldiers, and they've got all their AK-47s and semi-automatic weapons. And of course, the Secret Service is very concerned, and it's about 5 to 1. There are 5 soldiers for every Secret Service agent in this thing. President Bush comes out and says, hey, guys, can you keep it down? I'm trying to finish this meeting. He kind of diffuses the situation. The soldiers eventually put their weapons down, and he has a very brief meeting. Everybody who witnessed it said it was absolutely extraordinary. He gets the military leaders assembled around a table, and he looks at them and says, my message is simple. You guys are going to stop this. And at first he slams his hand on the table, startles all the soldiers. And he said, I'm going to be serious. You're going to stop all of this activity. You're going to allow an election. And if you don't, President Reagan's going to cut you off, and you know what that will mean for this war. And out the door he walked, onto the Black Hawk helicopter he went, and he left with the soldiers still absorbing that message. It's a really
John,
great story.
The amazing part of it is here is this Yale graduate who is a combination of brilliance, and by the way, he graduated from Yale in 2.5 years while he was he was on the baseball team. He was the head of the baseball team, and then he's telling these people in the jungle, you do it my way, or it's not going to work out for you. He was an incredible man, but he didn't have all that bravado about him.
Not at all. Yeah, no, one of the things first I'll tell you just how risky this mission was. The helicopter pilot that actually brought him in that day, 2 weeks later, was shot and killed on a secret mission in El Salvador. So that's how dangerous the skies were at this time. And it's just remarkable to think back. But he's a very underspoken man. When I went to see him in 2010, he's a funny, self-deprecating man. But he didn't want to talk anything about himself. He wanted to talk about the state of the world. And you really got to see his intellect then. He said 3 things to me I'll never forget. The first is he was worried about the state of politics. He said, when I was in politics, you could be opponents during the day and friends at night. And today, opponents means enemies. And I worry about that in America. The second thing he was concerned about was just the general vitriol in the country. People seem to think only about themselves and not about the country at large. America second, me first. He was worried about that. And then the third thing he said to me, which I often got a chuckle about, was, in this world we live in today, we have no strategic, there's no Bush doctrine anymore. We just worry about the next 10 minutes of life. I worry about that. We ought to have a longer lens for America.
John
remember
Solomon,
those comments.
Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Judge.
All right. We know what he was like in the White House, and we know about his character, but what was President Bush like on the golf course? A man who hit the links with the former commander-in-chief hundreds of times shares some of his favorite stories with me. And next, the Reverend Billy Graham had relationship with several presidents, but what was special about his friendship with President Bush? The Reverend Franklin Graham joins me live next with his recollections.
unmistakable Cadillac XT4. Once again, driving is wonderful. Starting under $36,000.
Fires, torched cars, smashed windows, and looted stores. Police fired tear gas and a water cannon. More than 100 people were injured during the third straight weekend of unrest. I'm Robert Gray. Back to the judge.
Welcome back to our continued special coverage here on Justice, remembering President George H.W. Bush. Spiritual guidance and faith are key to every president. One of H.W. Bush's longtime confidants was the one and only Reverend Billy Graham. His son, Reverend Franklin Graham, joins me now to talk about the special relationship the president and his dad shared and some of his personal memories of the late president. Good evening, Reverend. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
All right, Reverend, can you explain how it was that the Bushes got to know the Grahams? Where did it start?
Well, my father first met Mr. Bush. This would be the father, George H. Bush, just in Washington, just at a couple of meetings where he just shook hands, didn't really know him. But he was playing golf in Florida. I believe it was at Hogue Sound. And Mrs. Bush, Dorothy Walker Bush, heard that my father was there and asked if he would come by the cottage. She wanted to meet him. So my father went by and they met. She was a devout woman. She loved God. She knew the scriptures. She had some questions for my father. And so as a result of that meeting, she invited him back on other occasions, and he got to know George H. and the rest of the family, and they became very close friends after that.
Well, so what you're saying is that George H.W. Bush, Bush 41's mother, reached out to your father. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's how it all started.
Okay, and after that, then a relationship developed, and I understand that they spent a great deal of time together, your father and President Bush.
They did. My father liked the former president very much. They became close friends. They spent not only time together when he was in China as the ambassador. He knew him, of course, as the CIA director, and when he became vice president, they spent a lot of time together during those years. But the president was a very devout believer. He was Episcopalian. He was very quiet about his faith. He didn't talk about it. He didn't wear it on his sleeve. But he had a very deep faith, and he and my father spent many hours not only discussing theological issues, doctrine, but also having prayer together. And so my father appreciated the president very much. And of course, they became close friends. And that friendship stayed right up to when my father passed away earlier this year.
How did the president's faith or his religion direct his politics?
Oh, that's an easy question to answer. You know, he was, first of all, he had Christ-like character. He was humble. He was faithful. He was a man who was gentle. He was a man of compassion. All of these are Christ-like characteristics, and that was his faith. Not only did he have the faith, but he lived out his faith, and he carried that not only through his presidency, but after he left the presidency. He used his voice as a former president, teamed up with Bill Clinton, who had taken the last 4 years away from him, and they became friends. And they went out and began to help people, especially in Haiti, where I've done a lot of work. They went down there to try to draw attention and raise money for the Haitian people after that devastating earthquake. And then same thing when the hurricane came into South Texas. President Clinton came down and spent time with President Bush, and they toured the devastated areas, raising money, trying to get awareness. But he had great compassion for people, but he was a very humble man.
Last question
the Lord Jesus Christ was very humble.
Yes, indeed. And the last question, they also spent time together in Kennebunkport. Very quickly before we go, how would you describe President H.W. Bush as it related to his ability to do a lot of sports things?
Well, first of all, he was, my father, I think, expressed it this way, he was on steroids. He got up early in the morning and he'd want to take a swim, and then he would want to go play tennis, and then he'd want to play golf, and then he'd want to go fish. My father said you needed a vacation after the vacation with George H. Bush.
All right, Reverend Franklin Graham, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us tonight.
Thank you.
All right. And here now to talk more about President H.W. Bush's legacy and his personal memories of this great man, former Deputy Assistant to President George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, an advisor to the Bush-Cheney campaign, Brad Blakeman. Good evening, Brad. It's good to have you here. You know, the president wrote your letter of recommendation for law school. I want to talk about that in a moment. But first, let's talk about the president on the world stage. Give us a sense of what it was like working with him.
He did his homework. He was focused. He was principled. There was a method to everything he did. He inspired people. I remember going to communist countries with him as vice president, instituting the Reagan Doctrine, getting the wall to come down in 1989. Now he's the president. And then seeing what was left with Reagan, with the wall coming down, was not the finish of the job. Now we had to buck up and create these free states. And he didn't turn his back on Eastern Europe. He helped them. He worked with them. And now today we have free countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, which are great friends of the United States. This guy was a statesman beyond.
Yes.
He was central casting for somebody who understood the world. He saw the world as it was, not the world he wished it to be.
And the amazing part is the man was a congressman. He was an ambassador. He was the head of the CIA, a vice president, the president, I mean, and you know, a military hero. There were so many parts to this man. But let's talk about his writing you a letter of recommendation to law school. How did that come about? How old were you when you met him?
Well, when I first started working for then Ambassador Bush, who was running for president, and then became Ronald Reagan's vice presidential nominee, I was 21 years old. I was out of college. I volunteered on the campaign. And during the course of him being vice president, we traveled all over the world. And we're at a fundraiser in Florida. And all the fundraising people had left. He was going to remain for dinner. And he said, everybody come, you're coming and eating with us. And I sat down next to the vice president. He went around the table and questioned each member of the staff, what's in your future? What do you want to do with yourself? And he came to me and I said, Mr. Vice President, I intend to go to law school. He goes, when you do, I'm going to write you a letter of recommendation. And he did. And then attached to the letter of recommendation was a note, and he says, I hope this doesn't hurt your chances. And that's the type of guy he was. He followed through, he cared about people, and he did what he said he was going to do.
And, you know,
I got in.
And you got in.
Yeah.
And then you ended up working with him even more. Well,
absolutely. And then his son. I worked for the son 2 years in his campaign, 37 days in the recount, and 3 years as a member of his White House senior staff.
All right. And your final thoughts before we close this segment, Brad?
He was the real deal. What you saw behind the camera is what you saw behind when nobody was looking. This guy was compassionate, he was real, he cared about people.
Yeah, very similar to the Reverend Franklin Graham. Brad Blakeman,
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for being with us this evening.
Thanks, Judge.
All right. President Bush, the country music fan. I'm joined live next by the legendary George Strait with a personal recollection about the man he knew well. Next.
Be wise beyond your years. Be young at heart. Do the little things. They're kind of a big deal. Get back to your natural hair color while staying true to your roots. Just for men, be the better man you are and look the part.
This is an invisible aligner from Smile Direct Club. It takes teeth like these and transforms them into those. Join more than 250,000 satisfied grinners for only $80 a month.
Oh, you went? Okay. All right. But
absolutely.
apparently, George, you struck up a friendship with the president. He took a liking to you. And you two ended up spending time together. How did that happen, and where did you two connect?
Well, after that time in 1989, you know, he picked me out at the end of the ceremony. There were several of us, and he had somebody come and get my wife and I and my son, and took us into the Oval Office. And he what's funny was he asked my son. He said, "Don't you need an excuse for being out of school?" And wrote him one.
He did?
And then he showed me a magazine, a country music magazine that my picture was on, and told me that he was a big country music fan.
And indeed he was. And in fact, in 2002, I believe it was, in March, the last live concert at the Houston Astrodome, you sang there before they closed it. And you again received an award from President Bush. I have it on my album. I listen to it all the time. And he talks about your being a great American.
Well, you know what? He was a great American, and it was such an honor for me for him to be there that night. You know, he came out and brought me on stage and talked to the folks, and actually came on the bus before the show, and it was just it was an amazing night altogether.
Well, and apparently after that, the two of you continue to spend time together, and I believe it was at Camp David, his last weekend at Camp David in January of 1993, that you went to spend the weekend with him. Tell us what that was like.
I'll tell you, Judge, you know, he called me one morning really early in the morning, and, you know, I had just met him. I didn't give him my phone number, but, you know, of course, he's the president. He calls me and wakes me up and invites us to Camp David. Well, you know, I'm like, I can't hardly believe it. But anyway, my wife and I and my son went, and I took 3 band members, and we did a little show for them one night. And so we're going to leave the next morning. That's our plan. And he asked me, "Are you going to church with us Sunday morning?" This was Saturday night. I said, "Well, Mr. President, we kind of want to get back early so we can watch the Cowboys and the 49ers play for the NFC Championship game." And he said, "Well, why don't you just stay here and watch it with us?" I said, "Okay." So we stayed with the church and had lunch and watched the football game. Spent the night that night. And, well, I know. Let me back up a second, because the Cowboys won that game.
Right.
And he says, "Well, let's call Coach. Let's call Jimmy Johnson." I said, "Okay."
Yeah.
So, you know, he picks up that red phone. He gets Jimmy Johnson on the phone. And less than 2 minutes, Jimmy Johnson calls back. And
wow.
So President Bush told him congratulations and all that. And he said, "Here, I got another George that would like to talk to you." And
all right.
so I got to talk to him. And
George.
then the next day, Judge,
yes.
he gave a speech to the troops. That was his last weekend at Camp David, and he gave a speech to the troops there in a big hangar. And
wow.
It was an amazing speech, and the troops loved him.
He
loved them, and he
there
was not
you.
a dry eye in that house when it was over.
George Strait.
It was just an amazing time.
Thanks you, George Strait. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for providing the music that he loved.
Thank you, Judge.
All right. And President Bush on the links, his longtime golfing buddy, shares some great stories in just a moment.
You do more than protect parks when you share the love. You protect